You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Sometimes in podcasting, you just hit the wrong button, which is what I just did there. So apologies for the false start on the music. And hello again, everybody. I'm Galen Clavier. This is Crimson Cast. It is the 20th of July of 2024, and we're getting closer and closer to college sports season restarting. We got our little break here in the summer, but football camp coming up soon. Basketball not that far away. Soccer going to start up again. A lot of volleyball coming up soon. Field hockey, track and field, I think. Golf, definitely. So lots on the horizon, but we've still got a couple of weeks of just like, let's kick back and relax and enjoy things. So that's where we're at right now. We're going to talk about some non-IU related items for most of this podcast. The second half of the podcast, we're going to focus on something that tangentially relates to IU. But if you're just looking for IU news, this is probably not going to be the podcast for you. And so I would never say skip it, but at the very least, don't go in with expectations that we're going to be breaking down like real hardcore fine-tuned stuff about the basketball depth chart or something like that today. But thank you all for tuning in. And before we get started, just a reminder, we're brought to you by the fine folks at Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs, as they continue to roll out some amazing, cool designs here with a bunch of different teams from across the country. We just had the UT San Antonio Roadrunners launch. We've had several other really awesome things that they put out throughout the course of the year, or at least the course of the summer, in this Sweet Summer 7 series. And UTSA was a big request for a bunch of people. They love the Roadrunners, mascot, and the overall color scheme is really awesome. Really cool collection. So go check it out at homefieldapparel.com. You can use the code HOME23 and get 15% off your first order. So do that. Get yourself in. The great thing about Homefield Apparel is they love giving discounts. And, they've had specials. They do specials regularly. You'll get discounted T-shirts. There'll be days where the whole store is like 20% off or 40% off. Doesn't happen all the time, but you get on their email list, which you will be on if you place your first order, and you'll know about those things. So go check out homefieldapparel.com, and also go check out their social media feeds on Instagram, on Twitter, and whatnot. Some good stuff there. And tell them we sent you. They always like hearing from Crimson Cast. Also, just a reminder, Crimson Cast is a part of Substack, as is the rest of the Back Home Network. Go ahead and subscribe to our Substack. It's free, crimsoncast.substack.com. Join the over 900 people who have done so already. And you get podcasts delivered right to your inbox. It allows you to skip having to search through social media to see if something is out there. We also try to include some additional items. There is a VIP option if you'd like to financially support the podcast. We certainly appreciate that. It helps us keep the lights on, helps us pay for production assistance, and helps some of our student workers get a little bit of cash in their pocket. So again, crimsoncast.substack.com. The base subscription is free and always will be. Check us out there. We would love to have you as a part of the community. Let's go ahead and dive in to a couple of items. A much requested item that we had was a review of College Football 25. And I got the early access version of this game. I paid for it. They didn't send it to me directly. And so I've been playing it pretty consistently over the course of the last week. And I wanted to kind of try to give everybody my reflections on what we've seen so far. It's interesting. I remember about a year and a half or maybe 2 years ago when this first got announced, we did a segment on the podcast where we talked about whether or not this was something that we were excited about. Obviously, the concept of a football game coming back at the college level for any video gamer, especially if you're Gen Xer or a millennial, this was something that was exciting to you because this was, I think, for people who listen to this podcast and people who are of that particular age, this was always one of the favorite sports titles. It had a lot more soul historically than Madden did. You really felt like you were building your own program in the dynasty mode. And, I think for a lot of people, even if the numbers didn't necessarily reflect it, if you were a college sports fan at all, this was the game you tended to gravitate towards. And certainly, I think for a whole generation now, about 10 years, it's been something you've heard about if you're younger, but you didn't get a chance to play. And so all of those things were positive. But one of the things that we tried to point out back a couple of years ago was that EA, Electronic Arts, the company that makes the college football game, hasn't always been the most reliable partner. A lot of the issues that we saw in the college football game series back in the late 2000s and early 2010s were things that should have been addressed and weren't. There were quality control issues. There were issues with features not working properly, or there were issues with the game not running particularly smoothly. Like, this was a pretty consistent thing that we saw in really the last 6 or 7 years of the title. And we did talk at the time about the concerns that I had, knowing that, about EA being able to actually pull this off. And, that was at a time when it looked like the game was going to come out last summer. It got delayed a whole nother year, finally gets released in July of this year. And I got to tell you, after playing it for a while, there's things about it I really like, but there's also a lot of quality control issues, which do not allow me at this point to recommend that you run out and buy it if you haven't already. If you have, obviously you're in the same boat as me, and I don't think it's a lost cause of a game. But I had a lot of people messaging me on social media saying, I'm thinking about buying a whole new gaming system just for this game. And certainly a lot of the hype that we saw around the game leading up to it, it looked like it was going to be an automatic purchase. And yes, if you've been on the fence about buying a next-gen system and getting yourself out there and starting a video game again, this might be a great launching point. So I'm going to talk about some of the issues that we've seen, also some of the good things, and then also, why or what I guess I would suggest people do as we move forward with everything. So let me start with the good. First off, the gameplay, the actual playing of the football game is really, really well done. The graphics are awesome. The player movement is awesome. The player movement, I think, feels natural. A lot of people have been complaining a little bit, who have been, people who are veterans of the old game have been complaining about the passing system because it did change. But frankly, I found the passing system so far to be really enjoyable to use. It's a little more intuitive, and maybe it's just the way my brain works, but I've really found it to be a good one. I found that the way that you control the receivers in the passing game feels more natural than it did in the past. So a lot of the actual gameplay is good. Playing defense is definitely hard in this game, a lot harder than I think any other football game I've ever played, but I actually think that's a good thing. It's one of those situations where you're really having to utilize football coverages the way that they are meant to be used in real life. You can't just simply say that you're going to, blitz on every down, or that you're going to use the same defense consistently. You got to change up your coverages. You got to change up, what you're doing with your players while using similar shells. Like, you basically have to confuse the computer offense, and that's how it's supposed to be, frankly. So I like all of that. And I've found that all of the games that I've played have been fun as I've tried to adapt to learning how to play defense all over again. But overall, I think they got the gameplay itself, the actual game of football is among the best representations that I can remember. It's not quite like the famed and NFL 2K5, that ESPN game that came out that still gets pointed to as kind of the gold standard of football games playing wise. It's not quite at that level, but I do think that overall, once you get used to the settings, it's a really enjoyable game of football. The problems kind of creep in everywhere else. And this is where I think EA was always potentially susceptible to not doing what they should have done within the game. And what I mean by that is this: what makes these sorts of games work is not just that you have the names of the features, but that the features actually have some corresponding reality that players can subsume themselves into. You want to be able to have immersion, relatively speaking, when you ask somebody to play a dynasty, which, essentially if you haven't played the dynasty mode in a college football game before, you're asking someone to take on a team, to take on a coach, and to essentially role play with that coach by building up certain skills while simultaneously using that coach to recruit your own program, to feel like you're part of the college football environment, and to move up the ladder, either move your school up the ladder, taking a small school and building it into a dynasty, or moving your coach up to where they're coaching a big school, and then you're forming a quote unquote dynasty there, and you're playing multiple seasons. And so much of that gets tied up in not just the recruiting of new players, but also the way that your current players are progressing and understanding like how they fit within the larger structure of your program, how they fit within the larger structure of the college football environment at the time. And I think one of the things that the historical college football series really did well, and this was, granted, this was back in the PS2, PS3 era, was it really did give you a sense that you were part of a living, breathing environment. And that when you went out and you were recruiting players, there was, there were personalities involved. There were reasons why they were choosing your school or not choosing your school. Is it 100% realistic? No, it never has been. But I think the problems that I'm seeing right now in this game are that there's a lot of things that the game is really struggling with. And some of them are surprising. Some of them are not surprising. The surprising things, frankly, are things that the quality control team for the game should have picked up early on. There's a real problem right now with the way that this game handles the simulations of other games, not your own games necessarily, but the way that like Georgia, when they're playing against opponents, how they're faring. What we're seeing, and this has been, I've seen this in my own dynasty play, I've seen this elsewhere. We've seen situations where, Georgia will end up with like 4 or 5 losses during a season. And look, I mean, could that happen? Certainly. But it's the losses to like FCS schools or, not particularly good schools in college football's FBS division. We've seen situations where you've got like 6 or 7 win teams in the college football playoff. And again, while that's theoretically possible, it's happening at a really, really prominent clip and in a way that is essentially immersion breaking for a lot of people. Even within recruiting, I actually really like the new recruiting system. I think it feels more natural and realistic. But it also kind of appears that the way that recruiting is running, it's not very intuitive for a lot of people. Now, part of that is players still needing to get used to the new system and not being used to the old system, or being too used to the old system, I guess you could say. But it brings up another problem with this game right now, which is that there are not that, at least to what I've seen, there's no tutorials or explanations about how any of this stuff works. We got some developer diaries, we got some videos that kind of showed what features were going to look like, and those are up on YouTube, but they don't really explain how they're going to work. Now, we've seen some vloggers go out and actually figure some of this stuff out. There's some really good tips on how to effectively recruit, but the fact that there's nothing really that effectively explains how most of these modes are supposed to work now is a bit of a confusing thing as far as I'm concerned. We're also seeing issues with like scheduling. Like I've seen a lot of reports of people that have gone forward 4 or 5 years in their dynasty and they're looking at other teams and they're playing like 4 or 5 FCS opponents in the same season, which never would happen. A lot of that seems to be tied to the fact that EA's video game is essentially trying to simulate an environment that doesn't exist yet in terms of scheduling, in that you now have a mega Big Ten, you have a mega SEC, you have a Pac-12 that's in the game and has 2 teams in it. And obviously that's been utilized, for people to go in and like create a custom Pac-12 or Pac-10 or whatever. But the game doesn't do that on its own. And so what you'll get is people launching a dynasty and then things are going really askew because there's not really a logical scheduling pattern. I mean, one of the things that was nice about the previous games was that even when you did custom conferences, the game would largely match what you would see in real life. So far, we're not seeing that in this game. So those are the kinds of things where, it does appear that you can go in, do conferences that look more like the old days where you've got divisions and you've got, fully stocked conferences, and the scheduling does work better. But again, I think there's a lot of users that don't realize that that's a possibility. And so then they struggle with some, I think, immersion breaking game issues. There's also some other detail related items that really need to be fixed. Online is already a problem from what I've seen. If you save your dynasty online, the servers haven't been able to handle the traffic. There's been people that haven't been able to load their dynasties. I've had problems with that on a couple of occasions. And yes, you've got the flood of new players coming in, and they'll probably adapt the servers, at least we hope. But again, it's tough with any game company at this point struggling with a large influx of users. It is a bit of a concern that wasn't something that was anticipated upon launch. And I do worry a little bit about the long-term ramifications of an online save system for dynasties. I would highly recommend everybody save their dynasty offline, unless you're running an online dynasty yourself, and then you're kind of stuck with that. Details in some of the other game modes outside of Dynasty. I've not done a whole lot with Road to Glory, but I've talked with people who have, and it just kind of feels like a limited games process at this point. Not particularly well fleshed out. Some of the logic in it doesn't seem to work that well. The commentary in the game is really bad. I've been playing sports video games for a long time, and it's easy to get bored with commentary eventually because there's only so many lines that commentators can record. Realistically, though, they're normally a lot better aligned with what you see going on in gameplay than what we're seeing in this college football game. The commentary just sounds hokey in a lot of places. It doesn't really match the excitement. It's overvoiced in a lot of cases. The triggers for certain lines don't seem to line up with reality in a lot of cases. And it just kind of feels like a very sophomoric effort for commentary. And it's very puzzling because, you go across a lot of different games in this spectrum, and they've been able to figure this out and do it very well in games that are faster paced than football. I think the NBA 2K series has done a good job with it. NHL does a good job with it. FIFA has done an okay job with it. It's weird that this game has these struggles in terms of how its commentary sets up. Is it game breaking? No. It's annoying though, to the point that like the last couple of games I've played, I haven't even bothered turning the sound on. I've just listened to music while I've been playing the game. So that's probably what I'll do in the future. Like, again, I would never say don't buy the game because the commentary sucks. But man, after 2 years with a lot of other examples, you would have thought that they would have at least gotten that down. So anyway, again, I want to reinforce that the core football gameplay is really good. And a lot of these other items, I think they're going to be able to fix. It's a little concerning that, as of Saturday morning, I don't believe there's been any kind of official note from EA about, hey, a patch is coming to fix some of these issues with simulations and whatnot. But, right now that hasn't happened. And while I think they will be able to patch things in the future, I am a little bit concerned that there were so many like detail-oriented items that were not addressed in the programming of the game or the play testing of the game that are clearly going to have to be addressed through a patch or through something secondary. The fortunate thing is that in this era, you can throw a patch out there pretty quickly and fix a lot of these problems. Easier said than done, says CrowdStrike after they crashed the planet yesterday. But normally, I'll use an example of another game that I've been playing lately called City Skylines 2. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's about the opposite of what you can get from a college football game. It's a city builder. But that game has been plagued with issues since it launched last summer. That team released a patch to fix things, and then had to release another patch immediately afterwards to fix some other items that broke. They did, though, and now that game runs pretty well, and that settled down a lot of the complaints about the game. So I think that'll happen with NCAA 25. I just hope that they're conscious that there are some of these glitches. And again, like for someone like me and for a lot of people, what people really want to play is the dynasty mode in this game. And you've just got to make sure that you've got the details down. I know that's a difficult thing to do in an era where college football itself is changing. The thing you're trying to simulate isn't there like yet. We really don't have a lot of examples of it, but we know what it should generally look like given how college football is played in the past. That's where I'm a little bit hesitant. I would be hard for me to recommend to somebody who hasn't bought the game that they go buy the game. And I would absolutely put the stop sign up on somebody who's like, I want to go buy a system and also buy this game. Don't do that yet. I would wait a couple of weeks. Let's see if they get this patch sorted. I will say for those who own the game now, it's not a lost cause. I'm still having fun with recruiting and Dynasty and kind of learning the ropes. I think some of the underlying fundamentals won't change. And what I'm essentially doing, and frankly, I do this with every year that I've had a college football game to play, I spend that first month essentially running a mock dynasty to try to figure out the controls and figure out the systems. And then I always restart the dynasty when the college football season itself starts. That's essentially how I'm approaching this. Unfortunately, we've still got a solid month plus until that happens. So I'm hoping that they're able to take that time to fix some of those issues. So if you got questions, shoot them our direction. Happy to answer those questions, but that would be my review right now of everything. Second and last topic for today that I wanted to tackle is the NIL settlement, ? We've talked about this NIL settlement for a while. It got announced a couple of weeks, I guess it was almost like a couple months ago now, where supposedly there was this settlement in the NCAA versus House case. It also folded a couple of other cases into it. And yet we haven't seen the settlement announced yet. And we talked about on one of our podcasts about how there was a possibility that this might not actually be a settlement that gets accepted by the courts or by the parties involved. And I think it's worth revisiting at this point. There's an interesting article. If you haven't subscribed to this yet and you're at all interested in name, image, and likeness related items or just kind of the changing business of college sports, I'd highly recommend, if you're on LinkedIn, Darren Heitner, Heitner, former lecturer at Indiana University, taught a sports agency management class for me back about a decade ago. Good guy, really sharp mind on everything related to IP and sports and entertainment. But he's been publishing this regular newsletter called Newsletter Image Likeness. Is already up to the 89th volume. And he had a really interesting one that he published actually, this was yesterday, the 19th, about how this settlement being delayed is really, really weird and fascinating and really odd, I think, in general, because the fact that it's delayed at this point is pretty peculiar. This should have been something where the parties involved were ready to roll on it, but there's a lot of things that are now getting wedged in to this settlement that probably shouldn't be there in the first place. And I think that there's a real argument to be made that it could create some real problems with the settlement overall. So there was an article in Sportico, also a good publication if you're interested in anything sports business related, by Daniel Libet, which is titled NCAA House Settlement Delayed by Infighting per Plaintiff's Lawyers. I'm going to just quote a couple of items from this article, and we'll put the link for this in our Substack if you want to go check it out. Jeffrey Kessler, the lawyer that's involved in this settlement, had a telephone interview on Monday morning, and he blamed, quote, infighting between the NCAA and its Power League co-defendants for the holdup. And essentially, back on May 30th, both sides of this settlement filed a joint stipulation asking for the court to pause deadlines to iron out a long-form agreement. And some of these items in the agreement that are being now debated that we're hearing are things like, what are scholarship limits for football going to be? And, there's also some other items related to what are going to be the limits on what type of NIL athletes at the college level would be able to take advantage of. The NCAA trying to essentially establish a litmus test for whether something is pure NIL or pay for play, and trying to forbid athletes from taking advantage of the latter. And the idea behind all of this is ultimately that all the athletes are supposed to opt into this settlement because they're going to get access to money. But that money is not all coming from like the Power 5 schools. It's also coming from the rest of the NCAA. And so there's like a corollary issue going on right now with this university called Houston Christian University, who has asked to intervene in this because they don't feel like they should be a party to the damages. So there's just a lot of messy things going on. But it kind of comes back to this core point, which is there's two elements to it. One, everybody just assumed when this thing came out that the settlement was going to happen. But it requires A, all the parties to agree to a core set of items, and B, the judge to say, yes, this settlement works. The second item is that it also requires that the NCAA and the Power 5 conferences be recognized as the authorities in this, and that everybody else has to go along with whatever the settlement is. And that's creating a lot of problems at the NCAA level. And as has been noted in Darren's newsletter, there's just a lot of question marks about whether the NCAA really has the authority to speak on this. There's a quote from Richard Johnson, who's a lawyer, and I'm just going to quote this verbatim because I think it's a really interesting quote. As far as this continuing fake settlement, not a single defendant has authority to settle in this case. So it'll be awkward for the defense counsel to explain that to the court. No, Your Honor, the NCAA didn't have a member vote to approve this. The NCAA board does not have the authority to do it on its own. No, Your Honor, not a single public university board of trustees authorized their president to vote in favor of this at conference meetings. The absurdity of it all is mind-boggling. And so there's a real chance that they're going to bring this settlement to court, and the judge is going to be like, do you have the authority to actually speak on behalf of all the people that you're speaking on behalf of? And the parties are going to have to say, no, Your Honor, we actually don't, which then will bring the whole thing into question. The judge in this case is not likely to allow this settlement to be used as a backdoor methodology for legislating college sports. But that's really what these terms of the settlement seem to be, that you're going to create this NIL fund that all of these parties are going to agree to, that all the athletes are going to be required essentially to take part in, and that all schools, whether they're Power 5 or Power 4 schools or not, will be living under. The whole idea that people keep missing in this is that the courts are forcing the NCAA and its member institutions and the conferences that those institutions are a part of, which are not the same thing as the NCAA. The courts are forcing them to do things that they don't want to do. And they've been dragging their feet on those things because they don't want to do the things that the court is telling them. And, even NIL, like what kicked all of this off, it was not the NCAA saying we're going to provide NIL. It was the courts saying, NCAA, you cannot forbid your athletes from making money on name, image, and likeness. You can't do it legally. And so what you've got now with this settlement is the NCAA and its member schools at the Power 5 level and the conferences trying to use this settlement to essentially legislate their own sport without actually going through the process of what you would do to legislate your own sport. And what I mean by that is, like, when the NFL in the offseason wants to create new rules or change existing rules about pass interference, about when timeouts can happen, things like that, those things have to get proposed. They go through a rules committee, and then the owners have to vote on whether they approve or disapprove those things. You've seen stories about that before. There's supposed to be a process internally through which you make changes. You're not supposed to use court settlements that, focus on the rights of individuals to make money off of their name, image, and likeness to then legislate your own sport, because you can't do it through the means that your sport itself actually employs. And that's essentially what's going on here. Normally what you would have in any kind of a circumstance globally with sport or locally in the United States is you would take these items, you'd put them in front of the representatives of each of the teams or each of the conferences, and they would have to vote on changes. And the problem is that the NCAA, as it's currently constituted, as we've talked about before, isn't just those top teams, it's everybody. And so you either, in that case, have to split the top teams from everybody else and let them have their own set of rules and have them vote on those rules and codify things, and then let everybody else do things on their own, which would effectively break the NCAA as an institution. Or you do it this way, which is you try to backdoor things and try to hammer them into a legal agreement. It's essentially the difference, if I was going to try to to put it into more like general terms, it's the difference between Congress passing a bill and then the president signing it versus the Supreme Court ruling that something's constitutional or unconstitutional, and that creating a new vacuum within which things have to be built. It's almost as if the NCAA and its member schools are trying to do the latter rather than simply work out an agreement amongst all parties. And the reason they're not doing that is that they don't want to bring athletes to the table as a bargaining entity. The colleges and universities, like there's just so many things going on. You've got the top conferences who want to separate themselves from the lower conferences and teams within the NCAA, that 1,000+ set of schools. You've got the kind of teams stuck in the middle who aren't quite at the top level but want to get there. You've got athletes who want a seat at the table but also just want to get paid for what they're doing. And ultimately, I don't know where all of this lands, but I do think that it's a real possibility that A, the settlement might never get hammered out to everybody's satisfaction, and B, even if it does, that the court might say, this is not a settlement for these cases. This is something else entirely. You have to go back to the drawing board, which could mean we don't actually have a settlement until the end of the calendar year or beyond. That was always a possibility with this. And the longer this goes, the more likely that, one of those two scenarios is going to happen, that either the teams and the conferences are just like, we're not going to sign on to this, or you'll get, universities like Houston Christian saying, why are we being expected to pay $2 or $3 million for something that we never did? And their argument is essentially, we've never restricted an athlete from taking advantage of name, image, and likeness. That was an NCAA thing. Now we're being asked to pay for this. So there's all these different factors that I think are going to come crashing together with this. And so here we go. And again, I do think ultimately what you're going to see, the NCAA continues to put all of its eggs in the basket of Congress is going to go and they're going to give us a bill that's going to, codify amateurism and basically say athletes can't be considered employees. I still don't think that's happening. We heard noise a few weeks ago that maybe there was momentum for that. It does not appear to be occurring anytime soon. And again, Congress being in position to do anything on this front, to ride it and save the day for the NCAA doesn't look like it's going to happen. If you don't have this settlement, that takes a huge chunk even out of that effort. And one can only wonder at that point what ends up occurring. So we'll keep you posted on things, but a fascinating space for everybody to be in right now. And certainly not looking like it's going to get solved anytime soon. So anyway, we'll take a break here. Tune in next week. We'll have some more podcasts coming up, and should be a fun next few weeks. Obviously, IU basketball alums playing in the TBT tournament. They won their first game last night against, I think, the Valparaiso alumni, and I'm not sure who they're playing next. They might be playing the Purdue team next. So should be fascinating to watch that. So check that out. And I hope you all have a good rest of the weekend. Should be a nice weather weekend here in the Midwest for most people. Thank you for listening to Crimson Cast. Thank you to our sponsors over at Home Field Apparel. Be sure to check out the rest of the Back Home Network as all the podcasts are firing back up. And I'll be guesting on at least one of those relatively soon. So keep an eye out for that. For all those people, I'm Galen Clavio. Thanks for joining us on Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.